Thanks for checking out my channel. Your support means so much. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give it a like, and share it with someone that you love. The Empath's Journey. Chapter 1. A World of Voices. From the moment she could remember, Amara had sensed a quiet, invisible thread that set her apart from those around her. It wasn't something she could explain easily, even to herself, but it was always there, an unspoken awareness that seemed to hum beneath the surface of her life. While others moved through the world with a kind of straightforward certainty, Amara often felt as though she were straddling two realities, the one everyone else saw and the one she experienced, rich with the undercurrents of emotions, thoughts, and energies that seemed to flow from every person she encountered. She didn't know why she felt so deeply, or why she couldn't simply exist without being tethered to the unspoken feelings of those around her. It was as though she had been born with a second heart, one that beat in time with the people she passed, no matter how briefly they touched her life. When she was a young girl, her friends played in the village square, laughing without a care. All the while she felt something more, often unexplainable, but palpable nonetheless. Something deep, something heavy, that was constantly pressing against her chest. She soon realized it wasn't her own emotions that she felt, but the emotions of everyone else around her, as though they had seeped into her very being. And not just with her friends, but also her family. When her father sat by the fire, lost in his thoughts, she felt the quiet worry simmering within him, a concern about something left unspoken. His shoulders were always tense, as though he were waiting for some inevitable calamity to strike. Her mother radiated a gentle joy, but there was often an undercurrent of sadness, something buried beneath the sweetness of her smile. Even the joy of their bustling village seemed tainted with the subtle hum of unspoken fears and regrets. In Willowmere, the emotions of others were not as tangible as the earth beneath her feet. Her sense of the world had always been heightened, and as much as it was a gift, it was also a burden. The emotions weren't simply whispers in the air. They pressed against her skin, entered her mind, and became a constant companion. Sometimes it was so much that it felt like she was drowning. And Amara never learned to adapt. Even as the years passed, and as she grew into a young woman, the intensity of her experiences only deepened, as her tender heart grappled with the emotions of others, which haunted her. Feeling every emotion, every sadness, every moment of uncertainty and fear was anything but a gift. It felt none other than a heavy burden that she was destined to bear. Even as she walked to the village market, she could feel the quiet melancholy of the elderly man selling fruits at his stall, or the bubbling excitement of Tomas, the young blacksmith's apprentice, as he dreamed of a life beyond the village's borders. One morning, as the first light of autumn painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Amara stood at the edge of the forest that bordered her town of Willowmere. Her satchel, packed with the essentials for her journey, felt heavier than it had any right to be. Her heart ached with a longing she couldn't name. It was as though the land, the people, and the very air were calling to her, urging her to step beyond the familiar paths and explore a wider world. The emotions she carried from the village were just too much for her to bear. She felt the pull to leave and to seek something greater. Her family and some villagers bid her farewell with warm smiles, their voices laced with a mixture of affection and curiosity. Some were sad to see her go. Others were too polite to ask why she had chosen this path. Yet they all shared a silent understanding, as though they knew this was a journey she had to take. Amara knew she would carry their emotions with her. The unresolved grief of Mrs. Thistle down the lane after the loss of her husband. The quiet longing of Tomas for something greater. The lingering tension of her parents' unspoken worries. But she also felt a flicker of something else. Hope. Hope to find answers that lay heavy on her heart. Why was she so different from her family and friends? Why she never felt the true belonging in this world? As she turned away from Willowmere, the familiar world seemed to fade into the distance, and a sense of freedom and possibility filled the space where her doubts had once lived. The journey ahead was unknown, but it was the only way to understand her gift and herself more deeply. Chapter 2. The Path Beyond. Amara's feet carried her down the familiar dirt path that led away from her home, the scent of pine and damp earth filling the air as she walked deeper into the woods. She was leaving behind a world she had known since birth, a world where every face, every gaze, felt like an open book, each page filled with emotions that she could read without effort. But as the village disappeared from view, Amara realized that the world beyond was unknown, a world where her gift might be both a blessing and a curse. As she traveled, the woods were quiet at first, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Amara paused for a moment, her hand resting on the rough bark of a nearby tree. She had always felt a deep connection to the forest, as though the very land itself understood her. The forest was a sanctuary, a place where she could listen to the natural rhythms of life, free from the constant hum of human emotions that followed her in the village. Here, in the quiet of nature, she could almost hear her own thoughts again. But as the hours passed, and the path grew more winding, the peace of the forest began to shift. The further she walked, the more she sensed different voices now, not just the comforting ones from Willowmere, but new, unfamiliar emotions swirling around her like an invisible fog. There was a sharp sting of anxiety that clung to the air, the whispered sadness of someone far off in the distance, and the flickering sparks of anger that seemed to dart between the trees. Amara had always been able to sense emotions, but this was different. These were not the simple, familiar feelings she'd grown accustomed to. They were untamed, raw and unfiltered. She could also feel them seeping into her skin, reaching for her mind, testing the boundaries of her gift. As the sun dipped lower into the sky, casting a warm amber glow over the path, Amara spotted a small clearing ahead. She had been walking for hours, and her legs were beginning to ache, so she decided to rest for a while. The clearing was peaceful, with soft grass underfoot and a small stream that babbled quietly in the distance. Amara sat down by the water's edge, letting the cool breeze brush her face as she closed her eyes. But the quiet didn't last long. These emotions, raw and unfiltered, came again, crashing against her like a wave. She could hear voices, faint but distinct, each one laced with a different emotion: fear, regret, love, and loss. She felt them as though they were her own, and it was almost too much for her to bear. She couldn't breathe, clutching the ground beneath her as she tried to steady herself. And then, as if on cue, a voice broke through the chaos, steady and calm. It was a woman's voice, but it didn't come from any one person nearby. It seemed to echo from the very depths of Mother Earth herself. "You carry a heavy burden," the voice said. Amara looked up, startled, but there was no one in sight. She blinked, unsure if she even imagined it. But the voice came again, clearer this time. "You carry the weight of others' hearts, the weight of their stories, but your journey is not theirs to walk. You must learn to walk your own." Amara stood, her heart racing. She scanned the clearing, but there was no one there. Yet the words lingered in the air, like a gentle breeze that refused to leave. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and a sudden realization struck her like lightning. She had always felt the emotions of others around her, but she had never truly understood them. She had been walking through life, carrying their burdens as if they were her own. But this journey was hers, and hers alone. For the first time, Amara understood that she had to learn to control the gift she had been given. She had to learn to set boundaries, to separate her own emotions from those of the world around her. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was the only way forward. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Amara felt the weight of the journey ahead settle deeply in her chest. She had a long way to go, but for the first time, she was no longer afraid. Chapter 3: The Meeting of a Stranger. The night passed quietly, with the soft rustle of leaves in the trees and the gentle gurgle of the stream beside her. Amara awoke at dawn, the pale pink of the early morning sky casting long shadows across the clearing. Her body ached from the long walk, but the emotional turmoil of the previous evening had settled into a quiet awareness in the background of her mind. The voice, the strange, calm words that had spoken to her, lingered in her thoughts, offering both comfort as well as challenge. She packed her satchel quickly, feeling the weight of it no longer as a burden, only a necessary companion. The road ahead was unknown, but the sense of direction, however vague, was beginning to take shape. She needed to learn more about herself, about this gift, and what it meant for her to walk through this world not just as a passive observer, but as someone who could shape her own path. As the morning sun rose higher, she resumed her journey, following a narrow trail through the thick trees. The woods began to thin, and soon the land opened up into a sprawling meadow. The grass danced softly in the breeze, while the distant mountains stood tall and unwavering like watchful guardians of the land. The vastness of the journey before her was both daunting and beautiful, a reminder that she was no longer confined by the boundaries of where she traveled from. It wasn't long before Amara encountered someone, a man on horseback, riding slowly along the same path. His posture tall and strong, radiating a quiet confidence. His hair, dark and windswept, framed a face that could have been carved from stone. A sharp jawline, high cheekbones, and the bluest of eyes that gleamed with an intensity that seemed to see straight through her. His gaze, gentle and inviting, as though their souls had recognized each other across lifetimes. There was a magnetic pull in his presence, an undeniable connection that left her with the unsettling feeling that they were meant to meet, even though she didn't understand why. His eyes, however, were the most striking blue, as though he had seen too much of the world. He looked at Amara for a moment, his gaze piercing, yet not unkind. She could feel something in him, a deep sadness that hung around him like a shadow. "Traveling alone?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. Amara nodded, though she wasn't sure how much she wanted to share with the stranger. She had grown accustomed to the solitude of her journey, and yet there was something in this man's gaze that made her feel less alone and quite safe. The quiet whisper of his emotions brushed against her own. Grief, yes, but also something else, something that felt familiar. "I'm not sure where I'm going," she said, her voice tentative. "I just know I had to leave my home. I'm in search of something." The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze softening. "I understand that feeling. Sometimes leaving is the only way you find what you need." He dismounted from his horse and stepped towards her. "My name is Kieran. I've been traveling for a while now, wandering from place to place, seeking answers for myself that always seem just out of my reach." Amara studied him for a moment. There was a strange familiarity about him, an unspoken connection that she couldn't explain. As she looked into his eyes again, the emotions swirling around him became clear. There was pain, yes, but also a deep sense of loss. A loss that was raw and unhealed, a wound he had carried for a long time. It wasn't the kind of pain she had ever felt from others before. This was something deeper, more personal. She felt it like an echo of her own longing, and for a moment she could almost taste it. "Do you ever stop in one place for very long?" she asked softly. "I mean, do you ever find what you're looking for?" Kieran was silent for a moment. His eyes became distant, as though he were searching for an answer he hadn't yet found. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe there's nothing to find. Maybe the journey itself is all there is." Amara felt the weight of his words settle into her. She knew that feeling, the constant search, the yearning for something she couldn't name, the sense that she was always just one step away from understanding, one step away from peace. She had been running from her gift, from her ability to feel the world around her, but perhaps the answer wasn't to run. Maybe the answer was in facing it, facing the emotions that pulled at her, the ones that made her feel both whole and fragmented. "I'm on a journey too," she said quietly. "I think I'm looking for answers, but sometimes I wonder if I'm ready to find them." Kieran smiled gently, as though he understood more than she realized. "The answers will find you, eventually. But it's the questions that shape who you become." With that, he mounted his horse again and gave Amara a brief nod. If you're heading north, there's a village not far from here. It's small, but you'll find people who can possibly help you find what you're looking for. People who understand the road that you're on. Amara, I hope you find what you're looking for, he said. She watched as Kieran prepared to leave, wishing silently that he might linger just a little bit longer. There was something amazing about him, something achingly familiar, as though their souls had crossed paths before. She yearned for more time to uncover what it was that drew her to him, but she understood. He was searching for his answers, just as she was seeking her path. Their encounter had been fleeting, yet his words lingered in the air, filled with quiet sincerity as he bid her farewell. I hope our paths cross again, Amara, he said, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. As Kieran disappeared into the horizon, Amara felt a stirring deep within her, a new and unfamiliar sensation that she couldn't quite define. It wasn't sorrow, but a tender ache, a longing that left her both unsettled yet hopeful. She pressed her hand to her chest as if to steady the feeling and took a deep breath. There was no time to dwell. She had her own journey to continue, her own answers to find. Pushing those emotions aside, she turned her gaze back to the road ahead, knowing that if it was meant to be, their paths would cross again. But for now, she would trust the pull of her own heart and the lessons waiting for her along the way. The pull of her journey was still strong, but Kieran's words left an imprint on her heart, as if he planted a seed of hope within her, a quiet belief that perhaps she wasn't as alone in her search as she once thought. She turned and headed north, the path ahead now clearer in her mind. There was a village to find, and with it perhaps a chance to meet others who might help her make sense of the world she was walking through, a world where emotions were both a gift and a challenge. Chapter 4: The Township of Ashbourne's Vale. Amara's footsteps grew softer as she wandered through the quiet village, her senses attuned to the subtle energy of this new place. The winding path led her towards a modest stall where an elderly woman stood, her hands nimble as she arranged bundles of fragrant herbs. Her skin, weathered and lined with the years, spoke of lives lived close to the earth, yet her eyes held an ageless wisdom, sharp and knowing, as though she had seen the paths of many travelers before. As Amara approached, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had known this woman in some distant way, though the memory seemed just beyond her reach. "Excuse me," Amara said, her voice gentle. "I'm new to the village. I was wondering if you might know of a place that I can stay." The woman's gaze lifted slowly to meet hers, the faintest of smiles playing on her lips as she studied Amara. Her eyes, warm and steady, seemed to pierce through the veil of uncertainty Amara carried, reading the depth of her thoughts with quiet understanding. "You're not from here, are you?" the woman asked, her voice low, carrying the soft echoes of the distant mountains. "And you've come seeking something, perhaps even something you don't yet understand." Amara paused, startled by the insight of this woman's words. It felt as though this woman could see straight through her, into the tangled knot of emotions and questions that Amara had carried with her for so long. "I'm searching for something about myself, I suppose," Amara murmured, unsure of how to explain it further. "I thought I might find answers by traveling, by seeing the world beyond what I've known." The woman nodded slowly, as though the answer was already known to her. "Ah, many come with that same thirst," she said softly. "Seeking, wondering. But sometimes the answers aren't what we expect. Sometimes they lay hidden within the very heart of what we seek." Here in the township of Ashbourne's Vale, there are many secrets, old as the earth itself. But the truest of answers often find when you're ready to listen. Amara felt the weight of her words, though they were cryptic, settle deep within her. "You must trust what the journey reveals," the woman added, her voice gentle but carrying an undeniable finality. "And if you truly wish to understand, seek the heart of this village. There you may find what you're looking for, or perhaps it will find you." With that, the woman turned back to her herbs, her hands steady as she tied bundles with practiced ease, her voice a quiet end to their conversation. Amara stood there, a soft weight settling in her chest, feeling both confused and intrigued, her mind swirling with the mystery of the woman's words. As she began to step away, the woman's voice called her back, warm and knowing. "You look weary. The road has taken much from you. Come, follow me." Amara turned, her curiosity piqued, and saw the woman gesturing toward a small door behind the stall, one Amara had not noticed before. The woman approached with an air of familiarity, her movements graceful despite her age. She reached into the folds of her apron, producing a small iron key. "I've a room upstairs where you can rest for the night. A bath, a bed, and a meal await you," she said, her voice soft but firm, as if she had seen countless travelers pass through in need of solace. She handed Amara the key, its cold weight surprising in the woman's hands, and gestured for her to follow. Amara, hesitant but grateful, accepted the key with a quiet nod. Her body ached so from the long journey, and the thought of rest, real, uninterrupted rest, was a comfort she hadn't realized she needed so desperately. They ascended a narrow staircase at the back of the stall, the wood creaking under their feet, and at the top the woman opened a door to a small, cozy room. "Here," she said, motioning towards the simple bed, covered with soft linens and a small wooden tub by the window, already filled with steaming water. "Take your time. When you're ready, come down and we'll see about that meal." Amara stepped inside, the warmth of the room embracing her as the exhaustion of her travels began to melt away. The woman's kindness, simple yet profound, made her heart ache with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you," Amara whispered, turning back to see the elderly woman's face, her smile both wise and knowing. The woman nodded, her eyes softening as if she understood exactly what Amara needed. More than just a place to stay, but a moment to breathe and to be still. "Rest and come down when you're ready, Amara," she said softly, her voice laced with a quiet, maternal warmth. "The village holds many secrets, but some are not meant to be uncovered all at once. In time, you will find your way." With that, she closed the door behind her, leaving Amara alone in the quiet solace of the room. Chapter 5. The Unseen Burden. The next day, Amara felt a growing sense of anticipation in the pit of her stomach, as though the village itself was waiting for her to uncover its secrets. As Amara walked deeper into the village, she noticed the people she passed were not as distant as they first appeared. Beneath the surface, there was a shared understanding, a collective emotion that pulsed in the air, a quiet yearning, an unspoken need for something more. It wasn't obvious, but it lingered, like the faint melody of a distant song waiting patiently to be noticed. At the center of the village stood a tall stone building with an arched doorway, its windows seeming to watch her as she approached. As she neared, the soft chime of a bell rang from within, echoing through the village like a whispered invitation. It looked like a small chapel, but there was something about it that felt different from any place of worship Amara had ever encountered before. It was ancient, its stone walls weathered by time, and the air around it seemed thick with the weight of history. Without fully understanding why, Amara stepped forward and pushed open the heavy door. The inside was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single lantern hanging near the entrance. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, old scrolls, and various artifacts that looked as though they had been collected over generations. The air smelled faintly of incense and dust, and there was a stillness that hung in that room, as though the space itself held its breath. In the far corner of the room stood an elderly man, bent over a desk, his back hunched with age. He looked up as Amara entered, his eyes sharp despite the wrinkles that framed them. Amara's heart raced as she stepped closer to the elderly man, whose sharp eyes seemed to pierce through the very fabric of her. He had spoken her truth, saying, "You are an empath," as if it were the simplest fact in the universe. It was a word she had heard whispered in the corners of her mind, a truth she had never been able to fully articulate. But now it was out in the open, and she felt both relief and fear in equal measure. The man gestured for her to sit on a worn wooden chair near the desk, his movements deliberate, as though he had seen 1,000 seekers just like her. Amara sat, her hands trembling slightly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "You've traveled far," the man said softly, his voice carrying a deep resonance. "Farther than most would dare. But your journey is not just a physical one. It is one of the spirit, and only those willing to face the unknown within can truly walk it." Amara nodded, though her thoughts were a whirl of confusion. She had always felt the weight of emotions in others, but had never understood why. Why was she the one who could feel everything so deeply? Why did it overwhelm her at times, yet make her feel deeply connected to those around her? The question lingered softly in the back of her mind for as long as she could remember. And now, finally, it was being addressed by this stranger in a room filled with mysteries. "You see," the man continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "an empath is like a sponge, soaking up the world around them without even trying." He walked over to a wooden bucket sitting in the corner of the room, filled with water, and dipped a small sponge into it. He held it up for her to see. This sponge, just by being immersed in the water, absorbs everything in it, everything it touches, every drop of water. It takes it all in. Amara watched as the sponge, now dripping wet, seemed to carry the entire weight of the water it had absorbed. The sponge, now saturated with emotions that were not its own, dripped water steadily, as though shedding tears, just as she felt. She couldn't control the flood of emotions around her, the weight of others' feelings pressing in on her from all sides. As absurd as it seemed, She felt like that sopping wet sponge in the old man's hand, burdened and overwhelmed by what it had absorbed. This, the man said, looking at her intently, is what it's like for an empath. The emotions, the energy of everyone around you, they seep into you. You can't avoid it. You feel it all. He lifted the sponge again, letting some of the water drip back into the bucket. But just as the sponge can release some of the water back, so too can you learn to release the emotions that aren't yours. Amara's chest tightened as she considered his words. It was so simple yet profound. But how do I stop from being overwhelmed, she asked, her voice small. The man nodded, understanding. First, you must learn what's yours and what's not. Not everything you feel belongs to you. Once you recognize that, you can begin to set boundaries. Protect your heart when needed, but never close yourself off completely. He placed the sponge back in the water, watching it absorb more. Remember, the sponge can hold only so much before it becomes too heavy, too saturated. You must find balance, a way to release what you don't need, so that you can continue to live fully, without drowning in the emotions of others. Amara closed her eyes, her mind racing with what he had said. Could she really learn to release the emotions that weren't hers? The man studied her quietly for a moment, then gave a soft sigh. The weight will always be there, but you have the ability to carry it without being consumed by it. You are not defined by the emotions you absorb. You are more than that. Amara nodded slowly, the path ahead beginning to feel a little clearer, though still uncertain. You must also learn to listen to yourself, the man said, as though reading her thoughts. You've been so focused on others, their pain, their joy, and their sorrow, that you've forgotten to listen to your own heart. Only when you understand your own emotions can you truly understand those of others. Amara felt a quiet stir of hope. Could it really be that simple? Listening to herself, finding her own voice again, that seemed like the first step toward healing. Amara absorbed his words, the complexity of what he was saying finally sinking in. It wasn't about ignoring the emotions of others. It was about managing them, about creating space for her own feelings without being overtaken by the world's turmoil. How could she ever achieve such balance? For as long as she could remember, she had been defined by the feelings of those around her. Her own identity was a blur, a mixture of the voices and emotions of everyone she had ever encountered. The old man continued, his voice steady and filled with a quiet authority. To begin, you must acknowledge the source of your pain, the weight that you carry. It will not disappear, but it can be lightened. You must learn to let go of the emotions that are not yours, to release them into the universe where they belong. Amara closed her eyes, trying to imagine what that might feel like. The idea of releasing all the emotions that weren't hers seemed impossible. How could she just let them go? The man's words resonated deep within her. He then walked to a shelf filled with various items and pulled down a small worn box. He placed it in front of Amara. This, he said, is a tool to help you begin the process of separating your emotions from others. Use it when you feel overwhelmed. Amara opened the box carefully, and inside there was a small polished stone, translucent with veins of silver running through it. It seemed to glow softly in the dim light of the room. This stone will help you center yourself, the man explained. When you hold it, focus on its energy, its stillness. Let it remind you that you are not defined by the emotions you absorb, and you do not have to carry them all. Amara held the stone in her hands, feeling its cool surface, its quiet strength. It wasn't a solution to everything, but it was a start. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude and the first stirrings of understanding. The man smiled gently, his eyes wise with years of experience. "The journey is yours, Amara, but remember, to walk this path you must first walk in your own shoes. Only then can you help others find their way." With a final glance at the stone, Amara left the room, her heart lighter than when she had entered. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Chapter 6. The Awakening of Self. Amara awoke early the next morning, the faint glow of dawn creeping through the narrow window of her modest room at the village inn. The stone from the elderly man's shop rested in her palm, its cool surface grounding her as she lay still, reflecting on the conversation she had shared with him the night before. It felt like the beginning of something, an awakening, perhaps, but the journey ahead still loomed uncertain, like a fog waiting to be cleared. As the day unfolded, Amara's mind kept returning to the words of the old man. "You must learn to listen to yourself." It was a simple phrase, but it rang with such profound truth that it lingered in her thoughts. She had spent so much time listening to the emotions of others that she had forgotten how to hear her own voice. It was as though her identity had become a mere reflection of those around her, fragmented, pieced together by the myriad of feelings of the people she encountered. She sat up and gazed out the window, watching the soft mist rise from the valley below. The world seemed still, yet it was alive with the energy of 1,000 untold stories. Every person she had met, every emotion she had absorbed, was a thread woven into the fabric of the world. But now, for the first time, she felt as though she could pull on a thread of her own, separate from the overwhelming web of emotion that surrounded her. Amara stood and dressed quickly, feeling the weight of the stone in her pocket, a constant reminder of her new purpose. She knew what she had to do next. It wasn't enough to simply understand others' emotions. It was time to begin understanding her own. She stepped into the quiet streets, the air cool and crisp with the morning breeze. The village was still waking up, and the few souls who were already out and about seemed to move with a quiet grace, their movements calm and measured. Amara had learned that the village was a place of secrets, but it was also a place of reflection. Here she could begin her own journey of self-discovery, away from the constant noise of her faraway home, where she had never had the space to hear herself think. Her first stop was the small grove she had noticed the previous day, just outside the village's edge. It was a quiet place, tucked between towering oak trees, where the sunlight filtered through the leaves in soft beams. As she began to walk, her steps light, as though the very earth beneath her feet was welcoming her. Amara sat on a large, flat stone, the coolness of its surface grounding her. She closed her eyes and placed the stone in her palm, holding it gently as she focused on her breath. The world around her was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant chirp of birds. For a few moments, she simply sat in stillness, allowing her mind to clear. But then, like a wave crashing against the shore, the emotion of those around her began to filter in. The joy of a mother playing with her children. The grief of a widowed woman walking alone. The quiet longing of a traveler passing through. Amara felt them all. Felt them in her chest, in the pit of her stomach, as though they were her own. She took a deep breath and reminded herself of the lesson the old man had shared. You must differentiate what is yours from what belongs to others. She exhaled slowly, focusing on her own heartbeat. She could feel the stone in her hand, its cool surface a point of focus. She was not these emotions. She was not the grief or the joy. She was the one who felt them, but they did not define her. Amara pressed her hand more firmly around the stone and visualized a barrier forming around her heart, a protective shield that allowed her to feel without being consumed. She imagined each emotion as a wave, crashing against her shield, but never breaking through. She was still present, still connected to the world, but she no longer felt at the mercy of every emotional tide that came her way. For the first time, she felt a sense of relief, as a quiet peace that settled over her like a gentle breeze. It was a strange, unfamiliar sensation, like coming home to a place she had forgotten. She had always believed that to be empathic was to be the emotions of others, to merge with them until there was no distinction between her and the world. But now, she was beginning to realize that being an empath didn't mean losing herself. It meant learning to hold the emotions of others while still remaining anchored to who she was. As the hours passed, Amara continued to practice, sitting quietly amongst the trees in this quiet oasis, allowing the feelings of those around her to wash over her, but no longer allowing them to overtake her. She felt lighter, more centered, as though she were slowly uncovering the layers of herself that had been hidden beneath the weight of the world. It was not an instant change. At times, she felt overwhelmed by the surge of emotions that came crashing in. But now she had a tool, a method for sorting through them, for holding them with compassion, but without losing herself in the process. By the time the sun had set and reached its peak in the sky, Amara stood and stretched, feeling a quiet strength in her body that had not been there before. She knew there was still much to learn, but today, for the first time, she had felt the subtle shift within herself. It was the beginning of something. She could sense that much. She had taken her first step on the long road of self-discovery, and though the path ahead was uncertain, she no longer feared it. As Amara walked back towards the village, she noticed the people around her with new eyes. She could still feel their emotions, but now there was a distance, a space that allowed her to observe rather than be consumed. It was as though the veil that had been lifted, and she could see them not just as vessels of emotion, but as individuals, each one carrying their own story and their own journey. There was a sense of connection between them all, a shared understanding that Amara had not fully grasped until now. She had always thought of empathy as a solitary gift, but now she realized it was a bridge, a way to connect with others, not by merging with them, but by understanding them in their entirety. As she continued through the village, her heart lighter and more at ease, Amara knew that her journey had only just begun. The village had given her the space to learn, to grow, to be the true test would come when she left this place, when she had to walk through the wider world, carrying the lessons she had learned and the boundaries she had built. But for now, she was content. She had learned to listen to herself, to feel her own heart beneath the layers of others' emotions. And in that simple act of self-awareness, she had begun to unlock the power that lay dormant within her all along. Chapter 7. The Path Ahead. Amara was to journey home today, leaving behind the quiet wisdom of this sweet, mysterious town. The day unfolded gently, wrapped in reflection, the lessons she had gathered of self-awareness, of empathy, and of the delicate balance between offering one's heart and guarding it. She was no longer the young woman who had left her village, unsure of her place in the world. She had transformed, her gift no longer a burden, but a beacon of light that guided her forward. As she neared the familiar hills that marked the outskirts of Willowmere, a figure appeared on the horizon. A tall man, his silhouette outlined against the orange glow of the setting sun. Amara's heart skipped a beat as recognition washed over her. It was Kieran. She had not expected to see him again. After their last meeting, she had thought their paths had diverged, each of them embarking on their separate journeys. But here he was, as if fate had woven their paths together once more. Kieran's eyes locked with hers from across the path, and a smile spread across his face. One of recognition, and something more, something deeper that Amara could not quite name. It was the same pull she had felt when she had first met him, the sense that their souls had always known one another, even if their minds had not. He crossed the distance between them with a purposeful stride, his presence steady and calm. And when he reached her, he spoke, his voice low and warm. "I knew I would find you again, Amara." She felt a surge of emotion. Surprise, yes, but also something softer, something like home. "Kieran," she said, her voice soft with a mixture of joy and curiosity. "I didn't expect to see you again." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Neither did I, but sometimes when you travel long enough, you start to realize that the paths we think are ours alone are actually intertwined with others. I think ours always were." Amara looked at him, her heart beating a little faster. She had always sensed that there was something about him that called to her, something beyond the simple connection of two travelers crossing paths. It was as if their meeting had been written long before either of them had even known it was a possibility. "What are you doing here?" Amara asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Kieran smiled, but there was a quiet weight in his expression. "I've been thinking about everything, how we both came here, searching for answers to things we felt beyond our understanding. And you know what I realized? I don't need to search anymore. I don't have to have all the answers. What matters now is what we do next. We've been given something rare, something valuable, and it's our responsibility to share it, to help others heal, and to help the world heal." He paused, his gaze steady as he continued. "What we share is our purpose. It's not about knowing everything now, but doing the work in front of us, one step at a time. We can't carry the weight of the world alone, but we can walk this path together, supporting each other and helping each other. Amara felt the weight of his words resonating deeply within her. The sincerity in his voice, that quiet determination, was familiar, almost like it echoed her own feelings. "And how do you plan to do that?" she asked softly, the question more of a reflection than a challenge. He met her eyes, a sense of calm assurance in his expression. "By sharing our gifts with others. The journey we've taken, the healing we've done, it's never been just about us. It's about preparing ourselves for something bigger. To help others heal, to help them see beyond their pain, beyond their divisions. Our gifts, our empathy, and our understanding are what can change things. We've had to understand our own healing first, but now it's time to give that to the world." Amara's heart swelled with emotions as his words settled deep inside her. It was true. The world, its struggles, its hurt, it could never be shouldered by just one person. But when we come together, our collective strength has the power to shift the course of things. She could feel it. There was a kind of quiet power in that truth. "I would love that," she said, her voice steady, filled with a quiet resolve. A small, genuine smile spread across his face, and his eyes held a warmth that seemed to brighten the space between them. As they stood side by side, the fading light of the day painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, a quiet moment full of unspoken understanding. There was much to do, so much to learn, and so many to help. But Amara no longer felt daunted by the enormity of it. She felt a kind of peace, a knowing that by sharing their gifts, by being present for one another, they could create the change they both longed for. They turned to walk towards Willamere together, and with each step, Amara felt the shift, the quiet revolution beginning to unfold. All those who possess this gift have within them to help create a new narrative in the world, one where empathy, compassion, and understanding were at the heart of everything. In the end, Amara found her truth, a quiet, unshakable force that echoed within her, resonating with the hearts of all she met. Her power was not one of dominance, but of harmony, a deep connection to the world around her. She realized that when we walk through life with clear intention, our paths intertwine with others, turning the journey into something shared, proof that we are never truly alone.